decade, 1970 to 1980, saw the purchasing power of the US dollar decline by 75%.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't surprise me at all to see that happen in the next 10 years. So you're cruising along, making $100,000 a year, thinking you're doing very well. And when you're budgeting for yourself in 2035, think about the fact that that $100,000 will buy you $25,000 worth of goods and services. So plan your savings and your retirement accordingly. I'm delighted that being anti-establishment has become popular. I'm delighted by the protest vote. As to Mr. Trump personally, I read his book, The Art of a Deal. And he believes fundamentally differently than I do. I believe in a transaction where both sides do well. And he believes in a in a winner-take-all transaction, a win-lose transaction. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that Mr. Trump is serious about cutting spending. I think he's serious about rewarding people who give him power. By the way, I don't think he's worse than who he preceded. I don't think he's as good as the people who purport to be his acolytes believe him to be. As to the Office of Government Efficiency, Department of Government Efficiency, pardon me.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Doge.
I think that's the strangest form of fiction I've read in many years. The first instance, to appoint the person who heads it, to appoint to that position somebody who has enjoyed literally billions of dollars of subsidies and transfer payments. I mean, Tesla wouldn't exist without subsidies, nor would SpaceX. So to appoint, admittedly, a very efficient hog who is well out up to the trough, as to be the person to remove the feed from the trough, seems suspect to me. The second thing, and Julia, you should have this person as a guest. There's a wonderful man named David Stockman. David was the director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Reagan years. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Triumph of Politics that all of your listeners should read. The Triumph of Politics describes how the Reagan Revolution, by the way, Reagan had a mandate. He didn't squeak through like Trump did. Reagan had a broad mandate to make government smaller. And Congress, in particular the GOP Congress, derailed the Reagan Revolution in 120 days. I think the chance that the Department of Government Efficiency has to rein in government spending, particularly government spending around entitlements, the $100 trillion problem, is nil. And we have to deal with it. We absolutely, positively have to deal with it. Did you know that it is estimated that the increase in off-balance sheet obligations, entitlements, every year, the increase, in the unfunded liabilities, is $2.5 trillion, and the increase in on-balance sheet liabilities, which is to say the quote deficit, is about $2 trillion a year. So every year, this debt pile gets $4.5 trillion bigger. Meanwhile, gross federal revenues last year before spending, all the money the government took in was $4.5 trillion, which is to say the problem gets bigger every year by the total income of the U.S. government. I laugh because the alternative is to cry or swear, something that would be unseemly on your interview. I would tell the truth, sadly.
Okay. We like the truth.
I'd tell all the intended beneficiaries, too bad, so sad, money gone. I would probably change the defense budget to reflect the dictionary definition of defense, which is to say the protection of the domestic interest within our borders. I wouldn't have troops in 110 countries. A rule presidency would be truly ugly. A fact-based presidency, one that isn't narrative-based, I think would be extremely unpopular with Americans. Inflation, or, there's a different way you can have a monetary reset: depression.
Uh-huh.
In other words, in that circumstance, you really truly admit defeat. You say to the $36 trillion in bondholders, sorry, we default. By the way, we're nuclear armed. Try to seize your collateral. We acknowledge that we can't meet the operating expenses of the U.S. government, never mind the entitlement expense. We have a depression, we have deflation, and we reset to the liquidation value of our assets. That seems highly unlikely to me. Americans are by nature positive people, and they would prefer to kick the can down the road rather than call the question. And I think that's what happens. I really, really think that the reset that we have is on the installment plan, like the decade of the 70s. We reduce our individual purchasing power very gradually over 10 years, rather than all of a sudden. Ironically, my friend Doug Casey says, the US dollar is the worst currency in the world with the sole exception of all the others.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do the arithmetic around most countries, including our neighbor to the north, who I'm very fond of, their math is even worse than ours. Their expectations are lower, and they have not had the ability for 40 years to externalize their inflation by maintaining the world's currency. But with certain exceptions, economies that have very high domestic savings, this problem is global. And the problems, the countries where the problem isn't acute, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, Liechtenstein, to a lesser extent Switzerland, yes, they matter to the residents, but they don't matter to the global economy. The U.S. the U.S. matters to the global economy. Investors are saying that inflation is different than it's being presented as, and they are requiring a higher interest yield on their savings, irrespective of their cost of funds. Traditionally, if you were a bank and you didn't expect higher interest rates, if the government was willing to lend you money surreptitiously at the Fed rate, and you could reinvest that money in U.S. Treasuries, long-dated U.S. Treasuries, you didn't worry so much about the yield curve because inflation wasn't eating up too much of the purchasing power in your long yields. That's changed. When the market takes up long-term interest rates irrespective of the cost of funds, what the institutional investor is saying, what the big investor is saying is, you have to compensate me for inflation. I think less, because I think the big institutional investors, given that they're part of the system, trust the system. I mean, clearly they don't believe the CPI number because they can add and subtract. It's not in their interest to accept being lied to.
Mm-hmm.
They're happy for you to be lied to. I don't think they feel under any obligation to believe the lies themselves. I think it's fairly naked, which is to say that they understand that inflation is understated, and they also understand, given the arithmetic that I've just given you, that the only conceivable way out is inflating away the net present value obligations. In other words, it isn't just that they believe that today's inflation rate is higher than the inflation rate that's being stated. When they look out over 10 years, they don't see anything that changes except it getting worse. If you were working in conventional media still, and you were drawing a salary, you would be stuck in this, but you're not. You're building your own business. To the extent that you increase your circulation, and as a consequence of that, you can increase your ad rate or however you get paid, you have non-contestable employment. Julia LaRoche can come out of this in much better condition. I came out of the decade of the 70s in much better condition.
Mm-hmm.
But people who don't have contestable lives, people who don't have the skill set to use inflation, that is to say, buying assets that appreciate, or people that don't generate from their own efforts utility that's viewed by the market as being valuable enough that they can raise their rates. Those are the people who are hurt. People who deliver mail, people who build cars, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
people whose skill sets are being challenged by people with lower standards of living in other countries that will do the same job for less. Those are the people who suffer. And those are most of the people. Most of the people in journalism aren't Julia LaRoche. They aren't people who generate value in and of their own volition and are able to build their own businesses independently and charge for the value they create. Most of the people in journalism, as you know, don't inhabit that part of the world because you've taken risk, because you've taken your future into your own hands. You will come out of the next 10 years, provided that you invest intelligently and don't spend beyond your means. You'll come out of this in fairly good shape. It's just that much of your audience, won't. Oil and gas is cheap. It's priced like the big thinkers, Joe Biden and Angela Merkel, were right. It's priced like the oil and gas business is going to go out of business in 2030, except it's not. It's going to continue to 2065 or 2070. So the oil stocks are cheap. And I think a Trump presidency probably is good for the oil business in that some of the really idiotic de facto regulations of the Biden administration will have gone the way of the dodo. Wholesale property and casualty businesses are cheap. The industry is getting sold off very hard now as a consequence of the California fires.
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure that I would want to be in the retail property and casualty business, which is to say I wouldn't want to be an auto insurer or even a home insurer. But commercial insurance and reinsurance is cheap, 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 cheap. Small community banks are cheap. There are a number of sectors out there that are cheap. I don't know them all, so I don't participate in them. I understand natural resources, and I understand conventional financial services, and I don't get tempted. I don't get drawn out of things that I know well. But I can tell you that banks with below $1 billion market capitalization appear to be very, very, very good value. The big property casualty insurers and the little ones, I think, are really, really good value. Some of the global miners are decent value. The oil and gas business, particularly the Canadian oil and gas business, is really cheap.